Alright, let's begin with the sound no corporation ever wants to hear. Not the crash of glass or the wail of sirens, but the quiet click of someone else logging in. That was the opening note of this whole farce, the moment when Ubisoft discovered that its carefully layered systems, its always online obsessions, its endless authentication checks, and account linkages were not a fortress, but a maze with the lights turned off. Hackers walked in, stayed long enough to make themselves comfortable, and walked out with tens of terabytes of Ubisoft's internal history. Source code, SDKs, tools, decades of work, stretching from the 1990s to today, hauled off like furniture from an abandoned apartment. The funniest part is not that it happened, but that anyone is surprised. This is the same company that has spent years lecturing players about security, ownership, and access, while apparently treating its own internal vault like a storage locker with a loose hinge. Ubisoft has always loved control, loved telling everyone else how things must work, and now it turns out that the one system it failed to control was itself. There is a particular kind of comedy reserved for moments like this, the kind where the joke does not need embellishment, because reality already overshot satire by several miles. Hackers did not just steal upcoming projects, or a single unreleased build. They took a cross-section of Ubisoft's entire creative spine, engines layered on engines, tools duct taped together over generations, code written by people who left the company before some of its current executives learned how to send email. It is as if someone cracked open a museum, a factory, and a landfill at the same time. And all of it happened quietly enough that players were the first to notice something was wrong. Accounts froze. Purchases appeared out of nowhere. In-game currency vanished. Stores shut down without warning. Ubisoft's response was not transparency or speed, but the familiar corporate reflex of silence, followed by vague reassurance. The tech team was investigating. The situation was contained. The irony is sharp enough to cut glass. A company that insists games must be online at all times to function, safely somehow failed to notice strangers, siphoning off its internal systems for nearly 2 days. That is not just incompetence, that is thematic consistency. Because Ubisoft's modern identity is built on the idea that rules apply downward, never upward. Players must comply. Developers must crunch. Systems must be obeyed. Management, however, exists in a realm where consequences are abstract and accountability is optional. So when hackers reportedly exploited a MongoDB flaw to access Ubisoft's servers, it felt less like an attack and more like a natural disaster caused by years of deferred maintenance. This was not a masterclass in cybercrime. It was a reminder that neglect always collects interest, and Ubisoft has been borrowing against the future for a very long time. The humor writes itself when you imagine the hackers scrolling through directories labeled by year, watching the same systems reappear with slightly different names, the same assumptions hard-coded into new engines, the same design philosophies fossilized and carried forward. Somewhere in that archive is the origin of the tower. Somewhere else is the first spreadsheet that decided how much engagement a side activity should generate. This was not just a theft of assets. It was an X-ray, and X-rays are uncomfortable because they show structure, not surface. Ubisoft has spent years polishing its surface. Cinematic trailers, expansive marketing language, promises of living worlds, and endless possibility. Underneath, the skeleton has been showing its age. The breach arrived at a perfect moment, not because timing was malicious, but because Ubisoft was already wobbling. Delays, underperforming releases, layoffs framed as restructuring, morale issues whispered about, but never addressed honestly. Then reality leaned in and took the mask off. There is something almost respectful about how little effort the hackers needed to expose this. No dramatic spectacle, no manifesto, just access extraction and silence. Ubisoft did not lose face because hackers embarrassed it. Ubisoft lost face because its own systems confirmed what players have been saying for years. That the company is bloated, overextended, and strangely fragile beneath its branding. For a publisher that built its empire on the idea of persistent control, losing control in this way is not just embarrassing. It is poetic. It is the punchline to a joke that has been building since the first time someone was told they needed an internet connection to play a single-player game. And that is where the humor sharpens, because Ubisoft's response to criticism has always been to talk down. Players are resistant to change. Players do not understand the cost of development. Players need to be educated. And yet, here we are, watching a company that cannot secure its own infrastructure lecture millions of people about best practices. It would be funny if it were not so wasteful. All that talent, all that institutional knowledge, all that creative history, stored in a way that allowed it to be carried out the door like office supplies. This is not a story about hackers being clever. This is a story about a corporation being lazy in the places that do not generate immediate profit. Security does not sell copies. Maintenance does not impress shareholders. Stability does not look exciting on a slide, so it gets postponed, minimized, outsourced, and ignored until the cost of ignoring it becomes public. Ubisoft did not trip over a random obstacle. It ran headfirst into a wall it spent years pretending was not there. And the laughter that followed is not cruel. It is tired. It is the laughter of people who have been warning about this exact outcome for a decade. The breach did not damage Ubisoft's reputation because the reputation was already eroded. It simply confirmed the pattern. Always, online demands paired with offline competence. Grand promises paired with shaky execution. Corporate confidence paired with operational sloppiness. This is why the hack feels inevitable. It fits too well. It feels like the logical conclusion of a philosophy that values scale over care and control over trust. When you build systems designed to extract value endlessly, you forget how to protect what actually matters. And once the joke lands, it keeps landing, because the same company that lost decades of source code is the one that once tried to convince players that they did not really own the games they bought. Ownership, it turns out, is very important when it is your code on someone else's hard drive. The laughter is not just at Ubisoft. It is at the entire posture it represents. The belief that size equals invulnerability. The assumption that history substitutes for competence. The idea that players will accept anything, as long as it is framed as progress. The hack did not challenge Ubisoft's power. It revealed its hollowness. And once that is visible, it becomes very hard to take the grand speeches seriously. This is where the humor fades into something colder, because beneath the jokes is a pattern that deserves examination, not just mockery. So let us strip away the punchlines and talk plainly, because this is not just a story about one company having a bad week. It is a case study in how modern AAA development has drifted away from sustainability and toward self-inflicted risk. Premise first, Ubisoft's breach was not an isolated incident caused by extraordinary circumstances. It was the predictable outcome of long-term organizational priorities that devalued internal resilience in favor of external growth. Evidence supports this. Ubisoft operates sprawling, interconnected systems across dozens of studios and regions, layered with legacy code and proprietary tools accumulated over decades. Maintaining security across such an environment requires continuous investment, disciplined oversight, and a culture that treats infrastructure as critical, not auxiliary. Ubisoft's public behavior suggests the opposite. Repeated technical failures in live services, frequent account issues, launcher instability, and delayed responses to player-facing problems indicate systemic weakness. The hack exploited a known class of vulnerability, not an unprecedented zero-day miracle. That suggests oversight failure, not unavoidable fate. Further evidence appears in Ubisoft's crisis management. Players noticed disruptions before official acknowledgement. Communication was slow, non-specific, and framed to minimize concern, rather than inform. This is consistent with a company that prioritizes perception management over operational transparency. Now consider the broader context. Ubisoft has aggressively pursued always online models, live service dependencies, and centralized account systems. Each of these increases the attack surface. Each demands higher security standards, yet the investment appears uneven. Monetization systems are robust. Authentication systems are rigid. Player-facing restrictions are enforced meticulously. Internal protections, however, failed in a way that allowed mass exfiltration. This imbalance reveals a strategic bias. Systems that protect revenue are hardened. Systems that protect creators, history, and long-term integrity are treated as background. This is not unique to Ubisoft, but Ubisoft is an especially clear example because of its scale and visibility. Conclusion follows logically. When a company designs its architecture around control and extraction, rather than trust and stewardship, it becomes brittle. Brittle systems do not bend, they crack. The breach is not an anomaly, it is a symptom. And the impact extends beyond embarrassment. Stolen source code from decades of development represents intellectual risk, competitive exposure, and potential future leaks. Tools and SDKs in unauthorized hands can accelerate cloning, cheating, and exploitation. Even if nothing is released publicly, the damage is already done, because trust is not binary. It erodes incrementally. Players who already felt uneasy about account systems and digital ownership now have concrete reason to worry. Developers who poured years into projects now know that their work was not safeguarded as it should have been. The industry at large receives a warning it has heard before and continues to ignore. Large publishers are not immune. Complexity without discipline magnifies vulnerability. The argument that everyone is a target is true, but incomplete. Some targets are easier than they should be, because of how they are built. Ubisoft's hack aligns with a pattern of operational shortcuts justified by scale. It aligns with layoffs that reduce institutional memory, while leaving legacy systems intact. It aligns with leadership rhetoric that frames criticism as ignorance, rather than feedback. When these factors combine, failure stops being random. It becomes statistical. Now consider the human cost. Developers lose trust in leadership. Players lose confidence in platforms. Communities fracture under uncertainty. None of this is offset by a quarterly earnings call. And yet, the response cycle repeats. Investigate, patch, move on. No structural reckoning, no public accountability, no admission that the model itself may be flawed. That is why this incident matters. Not because hackers broke in, but because they exposed how little margin for error exists in a system built on relentless expansion. The logical endpoint of this path is not innovation. It is collapse by accumulation. Too many systems layered without simplification. Too many promises stacked without delivery. Too much reliance on control mechanisms that create resentment rather than loyalty. The evidence is not hypothetical. It is observable across releases, services, and now security. Therefore, the conclusion is unavoidable. The gaming industry, especially at the AAA level, must reassess its priorities or continue to bleed trust, until nothing remains but brand recognition and inertia. Ubisoft is not uniquely evil. It is uniquely illustrative. Its breach condenses years of warning signs into a single event that cannot be spun as a misunderstanding. And that brings us to the call to action, because critique without direction is just noise. For players, the action is restraint and memory. Do not forget these moments when marketing ramps up again. Do not trade caution for familiarity. Demand transparency, not reassurance. For developers, the action is collective pressure. Infrastructure matters. Security matters. Sustainable systems matter more than engagement metrics. These are not abstract concerns. They are the difference between stewardship and exploitation. For executives and shareholders, the action is responsibility. Growth without resilience is not growth. It is debt, and debt always comes due. The industry cannot continue to treat foundational integrity as optional, while selling control as a feature. Ubisoft's breach is not the end of anything. It is a signal. A loud, unignorable signal that the current trajectory leads to more of the same. More hacks, more outages, more trust lost. If the response is another layer of PR, and another round of quiet fixes, the lesson will be wasted. But if it prompts a genuine reevaluation of how games are built, stored, and protected, then something useful may come of it.